Darien Alexander Williams is an urban planning PhD student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His scholarly work centers on Black communities during disaster and religious communities that build alternative institutions during periods of sustained political resistance. He co-hosts season 4 of Disasters, Deconstructed podcast, and his media writing has been featured in Mother Jones, Fast Company, Reconstructed, and Undark magazine. Darien is a DCRP alum who began his work in hurricane recovery at the Coastal Resilience Center. And I believe you're working on Hurricane Matthew, right? Wasn't that? Yeah. So that was a huge project that went on for quite some time, because Matthew really whammied coastal North Carolina and even way further in down east from here. So with that, I think we've got a quorum. So Darien, do you want to start sharing your presentation? If you want to put questions in the chat, go ahead and do that, please. Darien, don't worry about those. Don't worry about catching them. I can relay them to you.
Sure. Let's see. Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Sweet.
Looks great.
Thank you. Let me actually time myself because I can ramble sometimes and I respect y'all's time. Hi, I'm Darien. He, him pronouns. I am coming to you from my living room in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on Wampanoag land, in the state of Massachusetts, which is also an Indigenous name. I'm really excited about being in this space with y'all because I loved taking this class when I was a student at UNC, and is really impactful for all of my work and continues to be impactful and something that I reflect on a near daily basis. So thanks for asking me to come back because it's a huge honor. And so this first slide has a bunch of names, not just mine, because I do my work in community with people who are my friends, people who I love, people who hopefully love me. And so my presentation is titled No Justice, No Resilience, the Abolition of Police and Prisons as Hazard Mitigation. This collective of people kind of came together after several years of discussing abolition and the role that prisons played in emergency management, kind of in the shadows, and getting many sort of abstracts or proposals or talk requests rejected kind of until last summer, and some of the sustained resistance across the United States and the world last summer in response to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders. And so that resistance opened up spaces for us to have more conversations and for us to get our things accepted to conferences. This particular talk, if I've shared a conference space with you, I don't know, I might have with some of you. Some of it might look familiar. I've kind of remixed some of it and updated it for this conversation in particular. But I really have to thank Carly Purdom, Sloan Rucker and Richard Thomas of the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons, Benika Dixon at Texas A&M along with Carly, and Fayola Jacobs, who is also an alum of this program and an alum of this class. And I love them, they're my people. So a quick rundown. I'm gonna kind of provide a fact base. It's gonna be a lot of information I'm gonna throw at you at one time. What is disaster? What are the similarities between what disasters produce and what policing and incarceration produce? And how do police and prisons sort of exacerbate disaster impacts with the sort of landscape that these sorts of things produce? Then we're gonna move into a more dynamic space and discuss how police and prisons operate during phases of disaster, before, during, and after hazard events. And then how does this infrastructure connect to all of our work for any of us who are interested in disaster risk reduction. And then we're going to get a little weird at the end and imagine a different world, and ask the question of what's next, and how I'll define abolition, and then how is abolition work also hazard mitigation work, and then and look at some models that that are helpful. Also, I live in a very noisy locale, so if you hear background noise, I apologize. So first, police and prisons as agents of disaster, and the similarities across all these concepts. So our group borrows a definition of disaster from Viola Jacobs' writing, that defines it as sort of the convergence of a natural and human-caused hazard in a population that is physically or socially vulnerable, and that disasters cause the destruction of property, disruption of communities, loss of life. Pretty sure y'all have discussed elements of this many times before. When we think about disaster, measurably, they disproportionately impact people of color, Black, Indigenous people. They affect LGBTQ people. They disrupt community economic resilience by eliminating jobs and reducing hiring and spurring business closures. It contributes to social disorganization, and reduce community and social capital, and even a sense of belonging. Disasters, as you may well know, attach stigma even to people who evacuate and have to relocate, or the quote unquote storm diaspora or disaster diaspora often deal with stigma in their new locations. Perhaps most famously, survivors of Hurricane Katrina, when they found themselves in other parts of the South, especially Texas, dealt with a variety of instances of discrimination. Disasters produce PTSD in their survivors and their families. They exacerbate chronic illnesses by disrupting disrupting food and water and interruption of medical treatment. And of course, lead to infectious disease transmission through post-disaster effects, from overcrowded shelters to poor nutrition to environmental change. And finally, when dealing with all of these things, survivors of disaster have disparate barriers to aid. So certain people kind of know how to navigate a system better than other people. And we see that measurably across different population groups, including race lines, class lines, gender lines, nationality, and language and ability. Now, when we think about incarceration, along these exact same categories that all of us who are interested in hazards and interested in disasters sort of consider, we see similar kinds of impacts. So it's plenty of empirical data showing that incarceration obviously disproportionately impacts people of color, Black and Indigenous people. LGBTQ people are overrepresented in prison populations. Prisons disrupt community economic resilience by attaching stigma to job seekers, so kind of condemning people to low wages and condemning people to poverty, even if they seek some form of gainful employment afterwards. Prisons are sold to towns as drivers of economic activity, which has also empirically been proven not to be the case. A former advisor of mine does a lot of work on that. Prisons and incarceration contribute to social disorganization. They reduce social capital. There's obviously stigma that's attached to being a quote unquote felon or ex-con. People who are incarcerated often deal with PTSD going inside and more PTSD generated on the inside. There's higher burdens of chronic illness amongst people in jail and prison. And incarcerated populations experience sort of elevated burdens of infectious diseases due to factors such as overcrowding, delayed diagnosis and treatment, and lack of access to water and sanitation. And we're going to touch on this in detail in a second. And finally, they construct disparate barriers to aid through stigma. So certain people might know that there's programs available to help people on the outside access job training, to access housing, and in some cases, people might be prevented from that based on language, based on location, based on gender. So that was a mouthful. Thank you for bearing with me on that. We're gonna take it a little bit slower now, and think about police and prisons during disaster. And so, just to kind of start, like, it can be argued, it has been argued that crime is a social construct, and I rely on critical resistance definition of criminalization. So the process through which actions become illegal only after they're sort of culturally or legally defined as crimes. For our generation, it's probably most salient when talking about like controlled substances or drugs, or like cannabis, marijuana, weed, where a substance was not illegal, but through cultural turns, political turns, legal turns, historically it became illegal. That had ramifications for the entire population. And now folks are like, wait, weed is fine. Like actually, actually, this system that we've built is producing more harm than the substance itself, measurably. So like we need to do something about it. And there's nothing sort of inherently criminal beyond what we put in our legal code. So that kind of helps us when engaging like a wide view of policing. And so all of the ways that sort of actions are considered illegal and requiring some sort of systemic response. So policing isn't just someone in a uniform and a badge. Policing takes the form of surveillance, martial law and militarization, and also reporting members of your own community for behaviors deemed suspicious or unseemly. Our collective argues that all communities, like not even just communities of color, like all communities are over-policed. Communities of color are hyper-policed, meaning there's additional infrastructure set up for the management of certain communities. But in a sense, we're all kind of subjected to navigating systems that could at any moment for some of us place us in confinement. And so police during disasters are one of several emergency responders. You know, there's EMS people, there's fire people who do work. Police do a lot of work during disaster. There are many cases where police are deployed to maintain order or to protect property or mitigate looting and crime, or perceived crime wave. And that particular role, which a lot of resources goes to, is dependent on a common misconception that is dispelled by research, that disasters create an environment where people willingly engage in crime and willingly engage in looting. And in fact, research shows that communities tend to act in a pro-social manner in disasters, and even most instances where people have recalled or reflected on breaking the law has been done in a pro-social way, such as trying to attend to someone who's in an emergency, whose life depended on a resource that they needed access to. And so in that space, so that's kind of, you know, mid-disaster, this is kind of how police move through spaces. They also, you know, direct people to evacuate things. They also participate in search and rescue. There's many roles that this institution sort of plays that could be imagined in other ways. When we think about prisons, prisons themselves as facilities are socially and geographically isolated. They tend to be, and measurably so, are in more rural locations, are farther south, are in counties that are Blacker and browner. They tend to be overcrowded and over capacity. They are quite expensive to build and maintain. And as a result, when they're sited, they tend to be sited on very cheap pieces of land, which as many of you know, does not lead to a resilient, I guess, sort of situation regarding elevations and floodplains. So many prisons tend to be directly in a floodplain or surrounded by a floodplain in a way that endangers people incarcerated there and everyone who works there. And so disasters and climate change continue to make sort of these facilities hazardous and increasingly inhabitable over time. So from hurricanes hitting prisons, which many of us have read about, thank you for reading about it if you have, to heat waves and cold snaps for prisons that don't have heaters, don't have air conditioning facility, like many of the prisons that people on my team work with in Texas, to prisons being sited in spaces where the land itself is sort of so environmentally degraded that even mild rain events create a situation that's unhealthy for people working in the prison and around the prison and the folks living inside. There are so many instances of, let me check, here we go, of prisons being abandoned by the staff and people being left for days, sometimes in water up to their waist in their cell block. There's no escape, right? You're in a cage. There are so many cases of botched prison evacuations, such as the one in this photo where folks are trapped because of a flooded road and end up having to spend days outside with people with guns kind of hanging out around them and so much litter and waste surrounding them, which is that's a situation that lacks safety and dignity. There are so many contradictions, such as what we've witnessed during this pandemic that we're still experiencing, where prisons are sort of hotspots for COVID-19 outbreaks, but at the same time, their labor being used to deal with the disaster around them. So the case of New York, prison inmates producing and bottling the sort of New York State hand sanitizer, which I think is a really interesting example because it's not, the use of prison labor is not sort of limited to one major party in the United States. It's a norm in the government across party lines, across political lines. And so folks are making hand sanitizer while there's an outbreak in their own facility, and the facilities themselves don't have access to all of these sorts of these materials. This is a photo from Rikers Island. And even beyond COVID, very regularly, prison labor is used to clean up debris, litter, to gut homes, sometimes to fight fires, sometimes to rescue people, all while the facility itself might be experiencing a variety of these same burdens, but not sort of supplied with resources to deal with them. So I want to look at a case study that I've only recently been, looking into. This is MCI Norfolk, Massachusetts Correctional Institution Norfolk. This is the closest state prison to where I'm sitting right now. It's just south of Boston in Norfolk County. And it's interesting to me because I just Googled, what's the closest prison to me? What's the T? And, found this site. I heard about some water and sanitation issues kind of being a chronic part of people's experience in this facility as staff and as prisoners. During the pandemic, this was sort of the first prison site that had an outbreak of COVID-19 in our state that affected staff members and the surrounding community. And I was just kind of curious, what is, I see some water around here. What's the floodplain situation? Hazard people do. So this is kind of like a rough map. The blue is 100-year floodplain. And it's in a situation that kind of creates a little island And it made me think about how planners are engaging a space like MCI Norfolk. Okay, so this is a prison, it's a state prison, it's in a county, it's near a major city. It's like very clearly environmentally kind of precarious in terms of flood events, with like some flood kind of hitting all of the roads that go into the prison. So if a flood happened, no one would be able to really leave or get into it. And so if there were to be a disaster, you know, anything from like a heart attack to an infection that rapidly goes wrong to a mental health episode, someone would be stuck here and wouldn't have access to what they need. There's about 1,200 people here right now. Yeah, so I was kind of curious and thought like, oh, how are planners engaging this? Let me pull up the county plans for that cover this tract of land. And this is kind of where my discipline, some of our discipline is sort of implicated, where the planning documents for Norfolk County very explicitly kind of open up a lot of this sort of like data fact-based sections with, well, our numbers and our demographics are skewed because of the presence of MCI Norfolk. So where we can exclude these figures from our considerations about planning, we do. And this is like most explicit in the housing plan and the residential land use plan for the county. Stepping outside of just research, as a human being, I think that's unethical. These are regardless of who has jurisdiction over this land, this is a physical facility with implications for the community around it. The community's decisions do have implications for this facility. Almost all of these little waterways around it have been marked for or mentioned as very hazardous or former dump sites or having toxic waste. It's unclear if that's because of the prison or it preceded the prison and this was built here because the land was cheap. But part of our ongoing work as a team is thinking through ways to analyze plans for how they engage these facilities and how they don't. And this is one sort of example where this facility is kind of, in every sense of this term, a black box and a kingdom where it's kind of hands off if you're a planner. And the state people will deal with it, even though physically it's connected to the community around it and the parcels of land. A couple of minutes before this talk, I thought like, let me make this North Carolina specific because I miss North Carolina and I want to make it relevant to you. So this is a very rough slide, I'm sorry. But on the left, towards this like red dot, you see Tyrell Prison Work Farm. This is just south of Elizabeth City, where Andrew Brown was just executed by the police and there's ongoing protests. I'm really grateful for the resistance in North Carolina about that right now. But this is just across the water from them. And this is a very small minimum security prison. I did not know about this 2 hours ago. I'm going to be real about that. But it took only a few minutes to sort of pull up this prison facility that's part of this long legacy in the United States of ways to capture Black life following emancipation. So the US has a long tradition of agricultural sort of prisons that were meant to be places for Black people to be productive, because after emancipation, there were sort of widespread ordinances in cities and towns that were passed as unconstitutional as they were still enforced against being idle and being an idle Negro in public. And many of the people who were swept up by these ordinances were thrown in prisons and asked to pick cotton or tobacco in the field, right? And so that's where this tradition is coming from. Tyrell Prison Work Farm is way more recent. It was opened in the 90s. It closed briefly and was opened up very recently last year. And if you look at the floodplain map on the right, it's obviously this whole place floods. All of the blue is 100-year floodplain. The yellow is the 500-year. And you see this literal island of this prison facility here. And so you can imagine, and I quickly Googled and saw at least around, I don't know, the late 90s and early 2000s, the storm experience for this prison farm did not include evacuating the people incarcerated here. So if this whole place is flooded and these people and the employees are here, it's a very precarious and dangerous situation, and arguably an unjust situation that is, it's incumbent on planners and emergency managers to deal with it, rather than just mentioning prison facilities as critical facilities in their plans and kind of keeping it moving, which is usually the only explicit mention. So that is what is, and it's really heavy. You're gonna say
Heavy,
something?
but it's for real. So thank you, Darien, for bringing us that perspective. I'm sure
Yeah.
the students have questions in addition to the ones that I captured that you pre-submitted.
Could I
this little stilted? Yeah.
should I zoom through like one more quick section?
Please do.
Okay. And that is like, what do you do? Like, how are we supposed to deal with this? And I just want to put that that it's possible to sort of imagine a different world and work towards it. And it's really hard for an idea like abolition, which we'll define, to be articulated like across a whole society. No one has all the answers for everything. And so me and my friends are just like, let's kind of take off a piece of something that we're familiar with, like hazards. And so if abolition is a political vision with a goal of eliminating imprisonment, these forms of imprisonment that we've discussed and these forms of policing that we've discussed, and we think about mitigation as sort of reducing the loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters, we switch back to abolition and recognize that these institutions produce loss of life, produce damage to property, then we can begin sort of drawing connections. And I just want to say that this is sort of tied together with this idea of defunding certain institutions. The fact that over 80 billion is spent in prisons annually, that over 115 billion is spent annually in policing, and putting that sort of logic of like, we can take money from here and put it elsewhere, so that would, and it would be a saving. We would be preventing certain crimes from happening if we had adequate social supports and safety nets and services to deal with it. That is a really useful frame alongside the very well-worn hazard mitigation conversation that every $1 spent on mitigation saves roughly $6 on damages and recovery from the National Institute of Building Sciences. And so when we think about defunding our prison economy or police, abolition isn't just, let's keep the world as it is and get rid of these institutions. That would not produce a situation where we are all safer. It is about building alternatives to deal with a change of framework and to use those resources in a better way. And I just want to say there's a couple quick examples. This is not abolition, this is reform, but it's an important model in Louisiana where they committed to reducing incarceration by 10% over a decade, leading to estimated savings of over $183 million that the state has to reinvest in local programs and supporting victims of crime. And this is just 10% over 10 years, and this is just reducing certain sentences, making sure certain people are not sentenced to prison for some minor crimes, and increasing alternatives. And I guess within abolition, there's this idea of transformative justice, which is a bit of a buzzword. This is sort of my last point, but I think it's an important framework because it's a commitment, a sort of locally led community commitment to an alternative framing of justice and conflict resolution. And it's hard. It is very hard. to engage in transformative justice practices, but arguably prison infrastructure is very hard and brutal. But it engages the practices of community dialogue. It engages being held accountable by the folks in your community rather than not being held accountable, but being punished, which leads to reproduction of negative behaviors and negative situations. And there's certain case examples that are useful for our group that have modeled this, such as the Sista to Sista Collective in Brooklyn, New York, which was started in 1996, but in 2000 was galvanized when the police killed two young women of color in a neighborhood. And this collective, one, organized an action line, so a hotline for people to call that wasn't 911 to deal with gendered violence in their neighborhood. And they would have guarantee that someone would pick up the phone and connect it to a group to deal with imminent violence against women. And then a sort of a larger ongoing practice of sister circles, which has been modeled and scaled across the world now, of opening a space for anyone to come with a story about a harm that was done to them, and for that to be engaged by the group in a local way. People know each other, to describe and figure out collectively how to create a situation where that harm is not reproduced. So is that raising money for someone, getting them into a new living situation? Is that getting someone a job? Is that confronting someone who perpetuated the harm? Is that bringing them to the conversation? Is that getting someone mental health service that they might not be able to afford and raising money for that? So this is like very small scale stuff that is a useful model and a frame. And so I just want to say that there's no world that I can envision where harm does not take place. And that's real. But abolition is a vision or a goal to work towards, to build a world with mitigated harm alongside this idea of resilience, right? There's no world where a storm couldn't happen and couldn't harm people, or a volcanic eruption like what happened in St. Vincent recently wouldn't happen. But we can use a framework to strive towards building something where that harm is mitigated or avoided entirely. And so for our group, we see these things as two sides of the same coin. And so at the end of the day, I invite you, even if you're not convinced by this idea of abolition, which is cool, I thank you for listening to me. At the very least, there's 2.3 million people incarcerated right now as we speak in the United States. And these are human beings with goals and dreams and livelihoods. And I invite you to connect to those people, either through an organization or people in your past who you might know are incarcerated, and remind them that there is a society that is charged with their care, and that if they do have, if they're not there for life, that when they are free, that there is a society they can come back to that will not put them in a position to end up in a cage again. And so with that, I'll say thank you very much. And I'm around if you want to talk even after this.
Thank you so much, Darien. These are, it's really impactful. Your presentation was great, a little different than most of the things we've seen, but with some themes that have been running through the entire semester. Certainly the social equity issues, not prisons specifically, but in general, that's just been a constant theme no matter what the presentation has been about. COVID comes up a lot because it has changed everything we do and how we do it and how we view even disasters. So I think you raised that a little bit, but I didn't hear a whole lot about climate change, and I did have a couple questions from the students about that, if you want to jump into that, or I can dig up the specific question, which my notes are just like all over the place right now.
Yeah. Yeah, climate change yeah, I only like briefly touched on that. I apologize. But um, so one of the many of the groups that we are connected to and organizing with are concerned about climate change in like a kind of unique way, and honestly a way that I found very niche, and I kind of discounted at first, but now I'm a little bit more open to it, which is the Texas Prison Air Conditioner Advocates, the TPAA, because there are many facilities in places that are experiencing increased instances of heat waves, but also increased instances of just kind of like record hot days that maybe wouldn't be considered a heat wave, but it would be unbearable if you're in a brick facility with like almost no insulation and no air conditioning, and you're trapped in a room that smells really bad with 20 other people, and you're sharing a toilet that doesn't work, right? Really awful. It's a dungeon. It's a literal dungeon. And so there's really unique ways now where an increasing number of people are thinking about climate change and prisons and heat. And heat is a less glamorous kind of hazard than, floods and volcanic eruptions and things of the sort. Something that I learned about while I was at UNC was that floodplains change and expand based on climate change, based on sea level rise, and also based on development on land and impervious surfaces, as y'all know. And that is an increasing part of the conversation for many of these prisons that are not necessarily in that island scenario that I showed you, but just next to a river where, well, North Carolina is really great because y'all have beautifully invested in the state having LiDAR mapping of the whole state. And so there's kind of a better picture of the floodplain there. Massachusetts is not a state like that. There's plenty of other states that have very crappy floodplain mapping. And so for prisons, it's a really dangerous situation. So as planners, it's like, okay, we go in a situation before or even after a disaster, and we say like, the flooding should have happened here, but people might say, no, like my building flooded, or this road flooded. It's not on the flood map, but they like ground truth it. That is nearly impossible to do with prisons, right? So the control of information and information about negative conditions within a prison is so strict that people have to smuggle out details about their facilities being flooded. And it puts vulnerable people in a space where they can make claims. They can make claims about flooding in their prison, and the state cannot take it seriously because there's bad floodplain mapping, and the old floodplain maps show that the prison is outside of the bounds of the flood. And so it's just like, who are you going to believe? The state of whatever, or someone who's cast as like an ex-con who, murdered someone and lied in court, and so now their voice is forever tainted and doesn't matter, right? So that's where certain groups kind of play intermediaries, and lawyers are helpful. And in this work, I developed an appreciation for lawyers, such as yourself, because climate change is making the literal landscape a place where facts are contested in weird ways, where like facts can just kind of not exist if they apply to prison populations. So that was kind of a roundabout answer, but that's what comes to mind.
Okay, thanks. Because again, that's a reality. It's a recurring theme, as it should be for all people interested in resilience, and it's not going away anytime soon. We're stuck with climate change for quite some time. I've got some interesting comments going on in the chat. A lot of comments about organizations that are working and activism that's been going on through groups that have been already established, which is fantastic. Zuri provided a link to Durham Beyond Policing, and Pierce have showed up an organization on transmission with a Z, which is pretty clever, about a prison project. So I haven't followed that link, but those are there. So anybody who's along this line of questioning, you guys are really helping each other. It's great. Darien, if you get a chance, it would be wonderful if you could peek at those and say what you think about what's going on out there. The related question to a lot of these are that I've gotten from a couple of people, Morgan and then Zuri, is that how do we go about getting involved? Do we, can planners do this? Do they have a skill set or a toolbox to use? Do we need new tools? That was brought up by Fern. I thought that was a pretty interesting approach, all of that. So does anybody want to jump in and kind of articulate what I'm trying to say by babbling?
I can. I guess my question more was like, what can we as planners do to like push the agenda to abolish prisons, like within our work? Like, what can that look like?
Good question, Zuri.
Thank you for that question. So for me, it kind of began with the final point that I sort of left off on. I reached out to someone who was a really close friend of mine in high school, who was, when I went to college, he was arrested and incarcerated for a very serious crime that he will not be leaving prison for. And I just reached out to say, hey, and, put some money on his books because it's rough out here and people need love, and got a sense of just his daily life. He's incarcerated in a facility in Kentucky that's right along a river. You can imagine the kinds of hazards that place is exposed to. And so I kind of learned about it a little bit through that. And then I also met or was introduced via letter to another friend who's incarcerated in Texas, in kind of the heat wave situation that I described. Was dealing with that. And it's in Beaumont, which gets hit by a lot of hurricanes. And so I would say, in short, getting to know someone incarcerated and just having that connection is a beautiful place to start. And there's organizations that can facilitate that as well, such as I'm a fan of Black and Pink, which connects LGBTQ incarcerated people. Durham used to have Inside-Outside Alliance, but I think that has kind of meshed with Durham Beyond Policing. I think so. And so I got involved there with Inside-Outside Alliance because there are many weird policy changes happening at Durham County Jail. And I think knowing someone on the inside, plus at least just knowing the existence of an organization is miles ahead of, doing something cool and technical and kind of plannery, right? So when I see hurricanes approaching the Gulf Coast, I read about whether or not the prison that my friend is in is evacuating or not, I can call an organized group that has lawyers and advocates and people doing phone banking who will apply pressure so that proper safety measures are carried out. And that's not just me, it's the fact that there's hundreds of people doing that. And I think doing that is like a really great way to start. And then after you're in that world, I don't know, people will just mention needs, like I need mapping, or I need policy analysis, or I just need someone to tweet things. And then you just kind of find your way. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does for the most part. I feel like what you're saying is we can support people who are incarcerated and just like bring attention to the issues. And so yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Darien. That was great. Good questions, Zuri. Well, I'm going to bring up, not that we want to bash or elevate lawyers, but following Hurricane Katrina, there were a lot of active legal representatives that weren't active enough because the prisoners continued to struggle. And but based on the Eighth Amendment of against cruel and unusual punishment, there were some cases brought because of the conditions following Hurricane Katrina in the jails, specifically in New Orleans, like you described, Darien, water up to the waist, and it was not clean water, and they couldn't get out. And also the courts were shut down because they were completely demolished and flooded. So right there we have a violation of due process and equal protection. Those are, again, constitutional violations. So there's a way to deal with some of these issues through the legal door, as well as the social activism part of it. And it might be easier to visit a prison than you think. It's definitely easier through an organization that's already established and has permissions. I mean, you can't just walk in and knock on the door of Central Prison in Raleigh and say, "Hey, I'm here to chat." But my own son has visited Central Prison as part of a organization that he was actually a law firm, a nonprofit law firm who worked with death row inmates. And he visited them, and it's one of the most impactful things that has ever happened in his life, he says. And they talked about the cases that were coming up, as well as maybe a basketball or current events. He was amazed that a lot of the prisoners on death row knew more about current events than he did because they sat around and watched CNN. So yeah, it's doable to be a visitor. So just thought I'd throw that in there.
Really
we have lots of messages along with more links. Excellent. Ear Hustle is an interesting podcast. Got that from Siobhan. Yeah, guys, make sure you are capturing these links for further study. Does anybody else want to bring up something?
I had a super quick question. I think it got buried, but it's not a big deal. I was wondering if you knew in North Carolina specifically if there were prison facilities that were impacted by Matthew and Florence, because when you brought up the Tyrrell County one, I was like, ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah. I don't know. I wasn't as plugged into prison stuff beyond, or prison and jail stuff beyond Durham when Matthew came by. I feel like there was like a thread that was picked up by the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. I know they had some people who were trying to keep a close eye on prison facilities, but I did not follow up with their work. I can imagine the situation being pretty bad for some facilities. I imagine some people were evacuated, so I don't know if people were like left, but yeah. And I will say, like, as a result of public pressure, and I think the last like 6 years of journalism, maybe 7 years, that was a really specific number, that there is an increased amount of, and especially after this like landmark ACLU report that looked at Hurricane Katrina, as was just mentioned, just the pressure alone is pushing certain facilities to more proactively plan and evacuate. But I don't know about Matthew or Florence. I'm gonna look into that. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Prison and floodplains. Sounds like it's more common than we'd like. And I find it very interesting that this issue of prisons is related to what happens during a disaster and are there evacuation plans. It's a population that we really never even think about. COVID brought it to light, but probably more because the contagion would spread outside of the prison through guards and other workers at the prison to the outside community. So that's when an alarm bell went off. Maybe I'm looking at it in a jaded way, but it does seem to be more than a bit of a coincidence that it took an outside impact for something to be done for inmates inside, so to speak. Anybody else? We've got 2 more messages down here.
I was curious, you said that you've done versions of this presentation in front of other audiences, and not sure in what context you've done that or who you've been speaking to, because obviously this is a very particular, like, disaster-oriented crowd. But I love this presentation. Thank you so much for sharing, and really love the connections that were made between disaster and policing in prisons and abolition. And I'm curious about the other audiences you presented to that maybe have been different in terms of their makeup and what their like interests in the topic are. And how they've received the presentation, just like making the disaster connection to folks in the prison and policing realm and making the prison and policing connection to folks in the disaster realm.
Thank you for that question. Really like the 2 sort of main other groups. One is like emergency managers, like practitioners doing their job every day out in communities, alongside some disaster scholars. And then this has also been presented to some organizers that were maybe thinking about, maybe we're explicitly abolitionists, but we're not sort of thinking about some of the environmental stuff alongside that, beyond sort of acute instances of environmental injustice. And then some planners. Honestly, this presentation is, we've gotten some like feedback that's been really interesting that kind of helps us improve our work. But even, and we were kind of bracing for a lot of critique from emergency management professionals, honestly. But no, I mean, it was received like pretty well. I think like providing a fact base that anyone who's worked a disaster like kind of viscerally knows is helpful. And like so many members of our little group, our like ragtag team, are people who've some of us who've studied disasters, and some folks who've like worked during disasters or organized at the very least like mutual aid groups. So yeah, I don't know. It's mostly been well received. And I think our point at the end of the day is like trying to make sure it's like sort of bite-sized, because I think the first time we had this talk, maybe it seemed very like a grand idea that was too big for anyone to sort of engage beyond like, oh, I think that's a good idea, or I think that's a bad idea. I think now we're working more to really drill down, and this is our work for the next few years, like the kind of case examples that I brought up, like really drill down like you can actually just look at specific facilities, specific plans, and change how those are engaged. And even just that act of engaging that material kind of binds you to a prison. Like you are now made aware of this group of people in your community that you might not have otherwise thought of. And that will guide the decisions that you make, even outside of, you know, hazard mitigation or planning or what have you. So, but it's been mostly positive. I'm really grateful for that. No one's hurt my feelings. One blatantly negative comment that was, again, really helpful. So it was welcome. Yeah.
Constructive criticism is always good.
Mm-hmm.
So a gun-toting radical is not so great. So Pierce, what you got?
Yeah, I was curious about, so you're in your doctorate program now. And so once you finish and you have that prestige of being a doctor, how are you expecting to be able to leverage that kind of, I mean, essentially clout, like having that kind of recognition? How do you think leveraging that will help your work?
Or
Yeah.
hinder,
Yeah, it helps.
depending on the setting.
For sure. And thank you for that addition. Like, because I think academics can sometimes like co-opt movements and co-opt situations and like make a career off of producing many like amazing papers that get cited or whatever, but like don't materially impact the communities that they studied. I know this is a huge issue with disasters. Who said this? Someone said this at UNC, like, don't be a disaster navel gazer. Like do the work alongside your studies, right? And I'm really grateful for that lesson. I'm trying to figure out or build a model for myself now for writing grants for work that I do in this line that includes line items for organizations and individual organizers who are also helping the work, but are not academics, and you know, are not trying to publish in whatever journal. That work needs to be compensated. Organizations that are doing, some of these organizations are like running mapping projects, are doing air and water quality, sort of like sampling and testing. And it's just kind of self-funded and they're doing it on their own. That work needs to be supported, I think. So I hope if I finish this program, I can like have more power to kind of control. Right now, it's kind of like tag on to my friends' grants. Many of my friends are just, you know, a few years ahead of me, so they're doctors, and do a lot of the writing and pushing. But so I'm hoping to do that myself to make sure that people get paid and that their actions and their movements are sustained. It don't have to be self-funded.
That is a novel approach to grant proposal writing, I have to say, and I wish you all the luck in the world. It's very brave. I know other people have done that before, is to, you know, tack on non-academics for whatever reason to help with their programs and projects, but it's not a widespread practice to do that. So I applaud you for that. Any last parting remarks? Because we've got right at 5. I know you guys have to go.
I just want to say that like that practice with the grants is something that I learned a little bit about at UNC through the community-based participatory research class offered at the School of Public Health. I hope it's still offered. It was taught by Courtney Woods and then formerly Steve Wing. They kind of do that, and they face immense difficulty with that, but they do it.
Right.
And so, you know,
I think some of the nutrition studies as well do that to really join up with the community as part of the project itself, including down to the level of helping to design the project at the proposal stage. So hopefully that's the wave of the future. We do have a couple public health people in this group of students, so look into that. You've probably already been exposed to it. So again, I don't want to keep